It may surprise you, but from space, Earth, even though it's this beautiful blue jewel, it looks like a still life. And you rarely see anything move, except sometimes, if you look really closely, you see this delicate white line being drawn across the sky. It's the contrail of a jet. And it's this small, beautiful reminder that life below never stops moving. But much like space travel, modern transportation has radically changed how we connect and has reshaped our energy use on a global scale. The challenge ahead, though, is clear. How do we keep humanity flying while moving towards a more sustainable future? Today, I'm speaking with Calin Rovinescu, the former president of Air Canada and a trailblazer in global aviation. We're going to talk about where we've been and what's coming next. This is On Energy. Welcome to On Energy. Welcome to Energy on the Move.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to see you again, and it's a pleasure to do this.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure for me. I've been thinking about aviation. You and I have known each other for years. My first flight was, well, at least the first one that I remember, was when I was about 5 years old. My dad had a little tail dragger, a Piper J3 Cub, and I just found it so magical to be able to leave the surface of the earth and experience what the birds experience. So I'm curious, what's your earliest memory of flight?
Well, actually, my earliest memory, it did not involve flight. My earliest memory of transportation was when my family left Romania. We were sitting on a train platform, and my father, tried to explain to me. I was 5 years old. Tried to explain to me what it was we were about to get into, and it was the mystery of the next chapter. And then, of course, while that involved a train and a ship, that method of transportation, the first time that I ever got on an airplane, I would have probably been a young teenager. And it was that same mystery that I had that I experienced with my father when I was 5 years old, sort of exploring new frontiers, not really understanding fully what it was that we were about to get into as a young teenager, not going very, very far. And I didn't, we didn't have the means to travel frequently as a kid. And I remember my first long distance flight to Europe as an older teenager, and of course that opened the universe for me.
Yeah, from that little 5-year-old kid on the edge of the train tracks in Bucharest, where transportation and the energy that transportation takes was about to open a whole new future for you. And it's really the core of what we're talking about today is how is transportation integrated into society, but also what energy does it take, and how do we balance that? And if we look specifically at air travel, it's more than just transportation. I mean, it's a pivotal part of society. It fuels economic growth. Think about how your first transatlantic flight, global connectivity, and so. Can you take us then, just sort of in a broad thumbnail sketch, from that kid on the train tracks, and then from your first transatlantic flight? How did the airlines' role in the world change?
You've touched on some of the great themes of what aviation represents, and we would. At the industry level, I was involved with IATA for many years. I served as chairman.
Just a sec, IATA is what?
IATA is the International Air Transport Association, which regroups something like 270 of the world's airlines. So basically, it is the underpinning of the airline industry. And we would often talk about aviation as a theme for good. Literally, it sounds corny, but I think we need to underscore why it's such an important industry. You were touching on some of that global connectivity, the idea that you can get on an aircraft in Toronto in a hull of composite aluminum, steel, and find yourself 12 hours later on the other side of the planet in China or Japan or somewhere like that is a miracle. People take it for granted, but that goes on. Global connectivity, trade, tourism, jobs, it supports a colossal number of jobs globally. Talk about sustainable development in regional communities. Some regional communities could not exist without aviation. And this year, I think the IATA, this International Air Transport Association, estimates that we will hit 1 trillion in passenger revenues for the first time ever this year. 1 trillion in passenger revenues, and have something like 5 billion people who are traveling.
Wow. To put that into context, I was looking it up, and the very first commercial air flight that I could find was in Tampa, in Florida, on January the 1st, 1914. So, just before the outbreak of the First World War. And it was the St. Petersburg Tampa airboat line. So that was 1914. But to put that into context, the oldest person in the world is, her name's Ina Lucas. She lives in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and she was born in 1908. So she was already like the age that you were when you were standing on that train platform in Bucharest when the very first commercial flight happened. So you're talking about those incredible numbers and the impact it has on society. And I marvel at the fact that all this has happened within one human lifetime.
One human lifetime, and the entire industry is 100 years old. Basically, that's about it. And obviously there have been some missteps, and we obviously know but Boeing's recent missteps. But it is a tremendous industry that has continued to evolve at an unbelievable pace over those 100 years. It's just shocking.
But let's try and put it into context. You mentioned all the different other means of transport, but how does flying compare to them with your experience with Air Canada, but as short and long range transportation, just to try and put it into context for reliability and efficiency? It's at this point still, and we'll talk about it later, but it's still a fossil fuel industry. But if you're given a certain amount of jet fuel, a certain amount of fossil fuels, how does flying compare to other means of transportation, just in a broad brush, for short, long range, efficiency, reliability, that type of perspective?
We talk about 5.2 billion passengers. That's a lot of people traveling across the planet. Of course, there are delays, there are cancellations, all of these various things that happen, whether they're weather related, whether they're maintenance related, whether they're, airlines going bankrupt or whatever it is. But it is an extremely reliable source of transportation. So, you look at Air Canada in particular, we estimated our economic footprint to be in this approximately $50 billion to the Canadian economy. And you get that number based on how much is spent in Canada, with a multiplier effect based on the industries that are impacted by aviation. And economists have got all kinds of different formula to calculate that. But basically, because of aviation, it supports hotels, it supports tourism and tour companies, it supports taxis and limousines, it supports airports, it supports the small SME, the small medium entrepreneurs who manufacture parts and composites and so on and so forth, all the various suppliers. So it has become sort of an essential lifeblood for so many that it is a reliable source of transportation, but it is also an underpinning of the economy.
So you must have thought about it in depth, but what does being a good corporate citizen mean to a man like you? And how did that personal philosophy influence how you conducted business?
Okay. So we, as part of our mission, we took it upon ourselves. We actually had a governance structure that encouraged sustainability and environmental responsibility from the very beginning of my time as CEO. We have something called a safety.
Just a second, I think that's important. Did you set up that governance structure, or did you inherit it?
Yeah, no, there was a governance structure for safety, and then I added on environment to it. So we had that same governance structure, which meant, as a group, we'd have the senior leaders of the company meeting quarterly on safety, and now we had added an environment committee to that same, and many of the same people would be involved because it involved people from the flight operations area, from the airports area, from the various other departments who could influence an environmental footprint.
And for everybody, I mean, we're talking specifically Air Canada, but it applies to everybody who's in like the organization IATA that you mentioned. We'll talk generically and then we'll drill down. But what are the biggest challenges and maybe opportunities in making air travel more sustainable from an environmental point of view?
Aviation is a great example of an industry that relies on fossil fuel, that needs to have less reliance over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. And it is too important an industry to say we will just simply stop flying and wait for something new to come. And the number of initiatives that exist here in aviation are numerous, but they're all at this stage minor. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be pursuing each and every one. And I'll give you some numbers which will show that they're actually very significant from an absolute number perspective, but there are many. One is sustainable aviation fuel. We need to do that. And now more and more airlines are using it. We were the first in North America, and I looked this up yesterday. It was 2012, and I'm proud of that. I'm even prouder today than I was at the time. We were the first in North America in a partnership with Airbus to fly an airplane on only sustainable aviation fuel to Mexico. And that was a first example of it. 2012. That's a long time ago, right?
That must have made you smile. Can you just take a 30-second detour and how did that happen? Like, you're proud of it. You said you're even prouder of it now than you were then. And that wasn't happening in 2009 when you took the reins. So that's the result of decision making. How did that happen?
So we built a partnership, and you can't do this on your own, of course, because the airline is not we're not a fuel producer. We're not a environmental company. We don't have conversion capabilities. So it took a partnership with several other players, including Airbus, including Bombardier, and several of the OEMs. And the OEMs in turn were looking and experimenting with alternative fuel, and the cost of it was frankly prohibitive, and it was just a small amount. And I'll come back in a minute to the cost. But it needed to prove the model. So it had been worked on for close to 2 years before we actually operated the flight, and testing and so on and so forth. And I remember at the time, my head of maintenance, who I have a great deal of respect for, really wasn't comfortable. He didn't like the idea because he didn't know. He didn't know whether this would impact the engine performance, whether this could damage the engine, whether we'd have a maintenance event in Mexico that we wouldn't be able to recover the airplane. Things like that. And so it took, testing and over-testing and being 100% confident that it was okay, both from a safety perspective and from a maintenance perspective. And it helped prove the model, and it helped in the overall evolution of this this entire environment. And when you look at alternative fuels today, the numbers are pretty significant. Let me give you, sort of an idea as to where we are today on alternative fuels. So that was 2012. By 2016, there were 500 flights that used some amount of SAF, sustainable alternative fuel. By 2022, there were 450,000 flights that used some measure of it. This is the industry-wide, of course. By 2025, the expectation is that there will be 2 million flights this year that will use some component of SAF.
And what specifically is, jet fuel, whatever you want to call it, it's like refined kerosene, and it's just a standard fossil fuel that's been used for centuries for other applications, but it become the standard jet fuel. What is sustainable aviation fuel?
So it's mostly, it could be several different bases, but it's waste oils, fats, municipal waste, and of course, non-food crops. Because there was a big controversy, and let's say probably in 2012 when we did that, there may have been using some of the food stocks, and of course that can't work long term. You can't, sort of take food crops away and use it for using to make sustainable aviation fuel. So it ideally would be waste, waste oils, fats, municipal waste. And there are some fairly significant processing facilities that have now been built. But the part is that, remember 2012, we were a bit of a pioneer. By 2016, 500 flights. 2022, 450,000 flights. 2025, they expect 2 million flights, and 1.3 billion liters would be used. Okay, that sounds like a lot, right? Yet, it still represents less than 1%, and frankly, 0.3% of total jet fuel production. And so, obviously, this is a driver, and it has to occur. It has to happen over time, but it's not replacing fossil fuels anytime soon.
So, as the CEO and in the work you're doing now in a lot of companies, and I want to get into advanced technology soon here, but how do you balance the fact that you're not getting immediate cost savings, but your operational viability, but with the desire to be in a role of responsibility, a good corporate citizen? How did you balance that?
So yeah, we initially these initiatives were to prove a point, to prove that it can happen, to be part of the test tube that would advance things, and for sure it has a high cost to it. There's no question that the expectation of the industry, and there were some initiatives that the industry got in and that Air Canada was involved with, including after I left, after I retired, that encourages governments. If we're serious about this, then governments have to support this creation of more capable in adequate quantities of sustainable aviation fuel. Just the way for long periods of time the government was looking at alternative sources of electricity and wind and solar and the rest of it. This is something that governments need to get involved with, and in some areas of the world, it's more advanced than others. But I viewed it as an important component of our overall environmental footprint. We are a consumer of fossil fuels. We are a corporation. We did have social responsibilities. This is something that we took on ourselves, before there were any mandated social responsibilities coming out of, governments, regulators, or anybody else. And then it evolved. And the industry, Chris, this is extremely important. The industry became, I believe, the first, if not the first, amongst the first industry-wide that said we will develop our own carbon reduction targets. Obviously, there were the Paris Accords and the rest of it, but the industry itself, and in conversations with ICAO, which is the UN body for international civil aviation, came up in 2016.
Based in Montreal, right? ICAO
based in Montreal. ICAO and working closely with IATA representing the industry, and came up with a model for a carbon capture, a carbon reduction, and carbon credits based on usage. But it basically is this carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And basically, complicated, took a while to get, because the argument would be, the countries that have been in aviation longer, like in North America, United States, you mentioned 100 years. So, arguably American airlines and Canadian airlines have been polluting the planet for 100 years, whereas in some countries they've only had an airline for 20 years. Well, why is it fair that, why should we pay the same thing in terms of carbon credits? So it's a very complicated formula based on different geographies of the world. But we came up with a model that was going to use, initially the agreement was we were going to use 2019 and 2020 as a baseline for carbon. And then we'd look to see, and you'd have to either reduce your carbon by activities that you're doing, or purchase carbon credits, which is going to have an additional added cost.
In all those years as the CEO and president of Air Canada, Uh, you probably had some really difficult days, probably had some fun days, and some people bringing crazy ideas to the table. When we look at energy and sustainable aviation, what originally might have seemed like science fiction, or were there any ideas that you got a lot of corporate pushback from, or what? How did you lead that charge, or things that your people really needed to fight for in order to change the status quo?
We had a fantastic person who was extremely passionate about new technologies on environmental sustainability, carbon footprint. And she would always come to us and to that committee that I referenced at the beginning on safety and environment with all kinds of projects and people pitching all kinds of ideas, a garbage recycling facility that was going to be able to produce jet fuel in amazing quantities. The first time I heard about this carbon capture thing, which to me sounded like science fiction, the idea that you could actually take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back in the ground, and leave all the rest of it in the atmosphere. It sounded like fiction to me. But we had an extremely passionate person who would continue to say, is it okay if I continue pursuing this? I'm not asking for any money right now. I'm not asking for any capital. I just want to know that, can I continue finding out about it? And my approach on stuff like that was always, sure, absolutely. Like, I don't know what I don't know. And if you can make me more intelligent by telling me what you're learning through that, that's great. But, we did have, of course, capital constraints and limitations, and this was not a open bar. You couldn't say we're going to spend on every single initiative under the sun to do this. And I think right now Air Canada has a $50 million investment bucket that they can put in new technologies, which is a good allocation.
Where do you think this is headed? Like, how long is it going to take? What is the speed of transition here?
Right. So first of all, technology, the number one evolution in technology, which is still far and away the biggest reduction in carbon footprint, is the evolution of engines to date. In other words, new aircraft, in some cases, consume 30% less fuel. So therefore, it is a cost saving to the airline when you buy a new aircraft. And it consumes less fuel, burns less, and therefore less of a carbon footprint. So I'm talking about the newer generation of aircraft currently in the market. And, that obviously requires capital to purchase, but you are actually at the same time saving fuel and burning less. The same thing with in case of Airbus, they also built the so-called NEO, the new engine option, the A320 NEO family, which was the same fuselage basically, but a new engine alternative, which again, similar idea, burnt a lot less fuel.
Okay, so part of the way we're addressing the problem is much more fuel stingy engines, and that is good because it's everybody can be more profitable and it burns less fuel. But it's not enough, right?
Not enough. And so therefore you say, what's the next evolution of engine? And they will continue to make improvements with the current engine technology. But now there is Airbus in particular has been touting a hydrogen alternative. Hydrogen, of course, is water-based, and it is plentifully available on the planet. It is something that it stays in the environment for a lot less time than jet fuel would, but it's extremely heavy, and to load the appropriate amount of hydrogen to operate. Would be you'd have to redesign the aircraft. You couldn't use the same fuselages.
Yeah, you said hydrogen is extremely heavy. In fact, it's the opposite, right? It's extremely light. Which makes the problem because it's not dense. It doesn't have dense power like some of the more complex fossil fuels.
And so the question then is, well, so can you design a new airplane that would be able to do that? We're many years away from that. Airbus had talked about 2035 had talked about 2035 as being a target date for that. I think that's been pushed off. I think that would be extremely ambitious. The regulators would have to get involved to certify an airplane like that from a safety perspective. And so I think we're still a ways away, but that is one of the exciting new technologies that is being actively studied. A lot of people working on it. Another one is electric. There are very.
Let me just frame that before we get into that, Calin, if that's okay. What we've talked about so far is it's a new technology, less than one human lifetime. It started out very risky, but if you look at the four sort of main pillars of energy security in a society, number one is how are we using this energy in a safe way? Is it reliable in what it gives us? Is it affordable? And then can it be done sustainably from both a financial and a environmental point of view? And if we look at aviation, we have made it safe. I mean, yes, when there's a crash, it's hugely visible, but for the number of flights that go, it's an amazingly safe way of moving things around. It's become very reliable. And with deregulation and improved technology, it's become affordable. But let's talk about the future of aviation now from a sustainable point of view. We talked about better engines. We talked about using biofuels. We talked about using hydrogen. But now let's get into some maybe more future-looking ideas. What are the new technologies that will change aviation?
Well, hydrogen would be one for sure if we got there. I mean, hydrogen is not just a alternative fuel. I mean, hydrogen would change it significantly if we ever managed to break the back of that. But a couple of the others that are being actively worked on are electric and hybrid. Electric, there have been many examples of it, and they're probably, I think the one that's the most advanced is a company called Joby out of California that has got now partnerships with several carriers, with several airlines. That is what is referred to as a EVTOL, electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle.
Well, that's what drones are, right? They're electric VTOLs, but obviously they're little and can only carry small things
and not passengers. Yeah, and so these eVTOLs are the easiest way to describe it. People refer to them often as air taxis. For the audience that may be familiar with the old '60s cartoon, The Jetsons, that I used to watch as a child. I mean, that sort of is what you'd imagine as like George Jetson type of a vehicle that's flying around.
It even made that distinctive little bzzz kind of noise, right?
Exactly. So they were actually pretty far advanced, that cartoon, I have to say. But the basically these eVTOLs would transport 2 to 4 people, go short distances. They're called for urban mobility is the expression that is used. But it is a technology that is evolving, and these vehicles, there are many of them, have got all kinds of different designs. There've also been some bankruptcies. A company called Lilium has tried and had some very good people associated with it, but they recently filed. So it's going to be like many of these other technologies. There will be winners and losers and companies that will try and will disappear. But the technology is there and it is evolving. Likewise, for hydrogen, the infrastructure evolution has to change because we have jet fuel providers at every airport. And how would that work exactly? So, each one of these involves a regulatory certification issue, a affordability issue, a training issue, and an infrastructure issue.
Yeah, imagine what it was like in 1912 when we had a terrific infrastructure set up for horses and the distribution of hay and the removal of horse manure and the regulatory bodies and the road signs. And then Henry Ford invented the Model T. And now, gosh, you need gas stations and driver's licenses and everything else. And so if you're going to transition from fueled airplanes to electric airplanes, or hydrogen-fueled airplanes, we're sort of at a similar crossroads.
Exactly. It's not just CORSIA. It's not just eVTOLs or electric technology. It's not just hydrogen eventually. but it is some combination of all of the above.
And you mentioned specifically hybrid. And I think a lot of people know what that means for a car. You plug it in overnight, and your first part of your drive is on electricity and the batteries. But then, if you need to get on the highway or go further, then the vehicle has both an electric drive system and a fossil fuel drive system. As our batteries get better, so is it the same? How would it work for airplanes?
Yeah, very similar. And in an ideal world, and of course, the technology is still evolutionary and needs certification and so on. But basically, the idea would be that you would have batteries, and which are very very heavy, and that is a factor. And how quickly can they be charged, and whether that would require a radical redesign of the aircraft. But right now, some of the folks who are working on this, still in stealth mode in some cases, are evolving it on the basis of in what circumstance would you have to use fuel, and in what circumstance could you use battery. So, keeping it very, very, very simple, and this is not necessarily the ultimate design. You could envisage that you would use the power from the turbines to take off and to land. But if you're cruising, why couldn't you cruise with battery, for example? And that keeping it simple. I'd say we're many, many years away from something like that being able to fly over the Atlantic or over the Pacific, but you could envisage it for short haul flying with 50 plus passengers, where you instead of a regional aircraft, a regional jet that takes you a certain distance, or a turboprop that takes you an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, you could envisage that technology working, and there are folks that are working on that. And again, that too will require support from governments to help fund some of the R&D.
So let's look into a crystal ball together. You've had tremendous success running one of the world's big airlines. You said this is going to take some time, but if we look, say, I don't know, a quarter century from now, because 25 years ago, that was just the year 2000. Doesn't seem all that long ago. So if we go ahead to 2050, we will have some truly sustainable flight by then, whether it's the little George Jetson zip around taxis, or whether we've actually got a fully electric airplane for some specific markets. But I want to pick on your brain. What is 2050 the right date? What does a truly sustainable flight experience look like in 25 years?
So 2050 is an aspirational target. Do I really think by 2050 we would have an industry that would, let's say you have the same number of flights as you have today, or more, allowing for the population growth that you'd have? Do I think that all of that is done with either sustainable fuels or electricity? No. I think that this is a longer journey, but I think that we can certainly break the back of the reliance on fossil fuels, and we can use some of these as transition fuels to transition, but it'll be a longer period of time. And remember what I said about the infrastructure and the regulatory approvals from a safety perspective, like those two. In many cases, you need to certify an aircraft 6 or 7 years before it actually flies, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it. And so, if you look at the ambitions on hydrogen, 2035, like they better get on it now, because it needs to be certified by 2028 or 2029, kind of a thing, right? Get the regulators on board for that.
Yeah, I just want to talk about one other tech thing, and then we'll wrap up, and that is fossil fuels, carbon fuels. It's some mixture of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, right? That's what the chemistry is, and all of those things exist in the atmosphere. And so, if you have a renewable energy source, say wind or solar, and you can run like a little cracking station, and you just pull the hydrogen and the oxygen and the carbon out of the air, then it is technically possible right now to create airplane fuel just out of the constituents of the air by using a potentially renewable energy source. And that's already been done. In England, they have made that little thing work. And, there's some places where it's always windy on the coast there. And now it's still quite expensive because it's not an efficient process. But they are flying a little airplane around using fuel that all of the constituents were pulled from the atmosphere. So when the exhaust goes back out into the atmosphere, even though it's still a carbon-based fuel, its net impact, its carbon footprint, its necessity for carbon capture is a lot lower. So if we can get a big energy source, and some people think we're pretty close to something like fusion with companies like the one that's working up in Massachusetts right now, Commonwealth Fusion. If you can get that energy source so that then you can pull the constituents from the atmosphere and make your fuel, then maybe that's a model for 50 years from now. What do you think?
The idea is fantastic, right? The exactly that. You capture the carbon out of the atmosphere, and you basically put it back into the ground, and you let the rest of it stay in the atmosphere. The question is it capable of being done on a large scale? And on a large scale, you saw the numbers that we talked about earlier in terms of the number of flights, the fact that it is, aviation is important to the global economy and to the evolution of so many societies, and so you can't eliminate it. These carbon. I would love to see something like that from a technology perspective. I think it's brilliant if you can mass produce it.
Yeah.
A guy by the name of Fred Lalonde is a Canadian entrepreneur who is looking, not more than looking, has built an initiative, raised capital to continue to build out this model, not specifically related to aviation, but to build out this model of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so it would be amazing if we could harness that. But the scale and the scope, as we're seeing with SAF, is very, very significant, and hard to see that you could, within the next 25 years, find the adequate quantities. And so I would say that, for the foreseeable future, we need to continue blocking and tackling and having some combination of all of the above. The carbon capture ideas, I love carbon capture. If we could brilliantly find a way to do that and put it back into energy sources, but the quantities are very significant, and especially for these long-range airplanes, and the scale of what's needed here.
The entire transition process, as it's been in aviation over the last 110 years, it takes time. But on the short term, what kind of changes can we make? Do you expect us to see in the next 5 years?
Yeah, 5 years is a period of time, I think, where you will start seeing some infrastructure developing around the EVtols, for example. I think you will see capabilities, just like we're seeing with electric cars and charging stations. You will see some evolution of the infrastructure for that, perhaps using defunct gas stations and adding facilities at fixed base operations, where private aviation operates, where you could have charging stations. So I think you will see some of that. I think you will see the greater evolution on SAF, on sustainable aviation fuels, with more facilities built out in different geographies. Because, of course, if you have one in San Francisco, you can't board enough fuel if you're flying internationally, right? And so you need to have it in other places as well. So I think you will see that. I think you'll see capabilities for storing it as well. Storage is another factor. The infrastructure to develop it, but storing it is another factor. So I think you will see combination of infrastructure development and SAF evolution. I don't think we're going to see in that time frame anything too dramatic on the hydrogen front, but you could well see the beginnings, although it won't yet be up in the air, but you could see the beginnings of some of this hybrid technology on smaller aircraft being proven out.
Yeah, how's it going to feel when you get onto an airplane taking off, and doing a short haul flight where, as you're sitting there as a passenger, you can see when it's running on pure electric. How's that going to make you feel?
Well, the same way as I feel in my car, I'm a lot more confident, I have to confess. I'm a lot more confident in a hybrid than I am in a purely electric car, because you never know when the electric is going to stop working in my mind. But in a hybrid aircraft where you will always have fuel, you always, if it's a hybrid aircraft, you'll presumably store enough fuel that you'll be able to use fuel as needed for emergency landings and this sort of thing. I'm inspired by the idea that it'll be partly operated on, with electricity, and the battery storage will be another factor that has to evolve. But I would be more comfortable in the short term in a hybrid than I would in a purely electric.
And you'll be partially responsible for the transition.
I hope so.
Calin, thank you so much for making time to talk about all this today. Thank you for the culture that you've built, and the seminal work that you've done to improve air travel, but also just the clarity that you bring. It's a complex problem, and you can't just jump off, the airplane part way. It's a big integrated part of society. So thank you for being a key part of that, and for the people that you continue now to inspire and enable.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks, everybody, for joining in. I remind you, in addition to just thinking about energy and travel, but I remind you how important it is to have your own personal dreams, to make daily decisions that change who you are and move yourself closer to your dreams. And most of all, find the energy to enjoy this amazing ride. Until next time, I'm Chris Hadfield on Energy.
Chris Hadfield on Energy is brought to you in part by Enbridge. For many decades, Enbridge has safely and reliably delivered the energy that helps power homes, industries, and communities. Today, they're investing in the energy systems that fuel people's quality of life. Life takes energy. That's why Enbridge is shaping a better energy future, because tomorrow is on. Find out more at enbridge.com.